what I thought I'd do today is talk about language conservation. Let me write that up there. Language conservation in its most general sense. What it is, how to go about doing it. Of course, we're not going to get all the details, but this tutorial is supposed to kind of highlight what's possible and what languageconservation.org is interested in doing and how you can help out. So language conservation, what we really mean is something like language preservation. And we both mean this historically as well as socially and contemporarily. Okay, preserving some kind of linguistic knowledge. Now, to understand why this is important, or why people are even concerned with this, we need to talk about what language is. And I'm going to make 4 really brief points about what language is. The first one is I want you to consider what you can do with language. Think about all the things that you do every day of your life with language. You might come up with a very short list or a very long list. It should be quite long, actually. Let me list some of the things. You can write, like I'm doing now, with language. You can read with language. You can create relationships with other humans, other people, right? You can create relationships. You can destroy relationships. You can do all kinds of things with relationships with language. You can talk about things that interest you. Maybe politics interests you, or religion, or any number of things. And the list could go on and on. The point is, we do everything with language. Everything we do as humans, we do with language. The second point we want to talk about is that language is part of our cultural identity. Now, what do I mean by identity? It means, a way of saying this is who I am. This is how I believe. This is the way I organize the world around me. So, for example, people often say something like, oh, in New York, we say X, right? Or in California, we say Y, or we wouldn't use that word, or the way we pronounce it would be different. Of course, this is within the United States, but we could also talk about other areas of English speaking. So we can say something like in Australia, we say it completely different. Here's how we pronounce it in Australia. And we as people identify ourselves according to the way we pronounce our language. So somebody from New York will say, I pronounce it differently than you do in California or Australia, and that's my identity. That's the way I speak my language. Now, this is, again, within the same language, but we can talk about this between more than one language. So, for example, I could say something like, my grandmother spoke German, right? And I speak English, right? Where her identity is wrapped up in being a German speaker, where mine is wrapped up in being an English speaker. Okay? And so the languages we use and how we use them really are representative of our cultural and social identities, including and also our national identities, right? Okay, so the third thing we need to talk about of what language is that language is knowledge. Everything that humans have learned over the thousands and thousands of years of us roaming around on this planet is somehow encoded in our language. The experiences of our ancestors, our values currently, it's all encoded in our knowledge, in our language. And so language becomes a storehouse of knowledge. Now, every language will have different sets of knowledge that the speakers will have valued. So, for example, in English, we value some things and it becomes part of our language. In other parts of the world, they will have valued other things and that will become part of their knowledge. So every linguistic system represents a unique system of knowledge, a unique conglomerate of knowledge. And then the last thing that we're going to talk about, number 4, is that language is interesting. Okay? What do I mean by that? Language is interesting in and of itself. We don't need to point out the identity or that we do everything with language or that it has all of our human knowledge is stored within our language. Language is interesting in and of itself. So let me give you some more space here as I kind of present this. So we can look at language objectively and look at its sounds, something we call phonology. We can look at its words and word parts, something we call morphology. We can look at syntax, which is the sentences and phrases, right, of a language. We can also look at semantics, which are word meanings or how things mean things, and pragmatics, which is what they mean inside of social context. Okay, these are ways that languages all differ. So, for example, in English, we have this really cool sound that we represent with the letters TH. It's the th sound of three and thumb, right? This TH here. This sound, incidentally, is IPA theta. And it is pretty rare in the world's languages. Not all the world's languages have this sound, and English speakers should be proud of it. It's something that makes their language very interesting. How they use the sound, where it can occur, its personal history of this sound is all interesting. Every language can say the same thing about its system. No language is identical in its system of phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, or pragmatics. Every language is a little bit different. They'll have different sounds, different words, different grammar and syntax. Okay, so for these four reasons, let me scroll up a little bit so you can see all four here. This is what, in a nutshell, language is. Language is everything we do. It marks our identity. It's a storehouse of our knowledge, right? And it's interesting in and of itself. It's a scientific discipline to study it, right? So now we come to something a statistic that's very disturbing. I'm going to choose white, so it kind of stands out here. 96% of the world's languages, 96% of the world's languages will be lost. Lost. Let me change that to a T. Lost in the next century. Within this century, sorry. Within this century. So maybe that seems like significant to you, or maybe not, but let me tell you how many languages there are in the world. There are roughly 7,000 languages in the world. Okay? Now, 96% of those are being lost. Now, with 7,000 languages in the world, what that means is there's 7,000 different ways of doing everything, 7,000 different identity markers, 7,000 different storehouses of knowledge, and 7,000 different languages that are interesting in and of themselves, right? So this is a big deal when we say 96% of this will be lost. What we're going to lose is a great amount of human achievement, of collective cultural knowledge and experience. This is a big issue. It's not something just to say, well, at least I have my language. Lots of people are losing out, and I'm going to point out some reasons why this is such a big issue. But let me just finish up here. This is approximately one language every 2 weeks. Okay, so we're losing languages really, really fast. Okay. Now, why are these languages being lost? Now, I'm just going to briefly talk about why languages are being lost right now. The other ones, in the next tutorial, we'll talk about it in more detail. But some of the things I want to point out is that people are shifting away from their language because of discrimination. Maybe you've heard of this, where people say something like, "Oh, if you're an X speaker, an X-ish speaker, you're not as good as I am, right? You can't compete in the global market because you have a funny sounding language," or something like that. This is discrimination. It's not true, right? Every language is valuable. Another reason these languages are disappearing is because of human rights violations. I'm going to put human rights here. Okay, things like genocide and marginalization are killing off the speakers of these languages. Now, what this means is that these languages are being lost not because it's a choice of the speakers, but because they're being forced because of some kind of prejudice by speakers of other languages. Speakers who speak one of these 96% of the 7,000 languages often shift to another more national language like English or Spanish or Chinese, German or some others. And with them, they lose part of what they are. They lose their identity, right? They lose part of their identity. They lose we as a group, but them in particular, lose a big amount of knowledge here. This loss is avoidable, and it's an issue. So what can we do? This brings us back to language conservation. Okay, so we're concerned with the language loss and what it represents to humankind, right? So let me write language conservation here, kind of messily. Okay, so what do we mean by language conservation? I said earlier that we mean something like preservation. Well, how do we preserve a language and the language tradition, including all its storehouse of knowledge and its identity markers? Well, the first thing we do is we make recordings. We write it down. So we have audio recordings and video recordings, and we make descriptions of these recordings and of the language, right? We'll talk about those kinds of descriptions in a later tutorial. We also do scientific studies, scientific research on these languages. Okay, so this is how we go about doing language conservation. We record these languages, we write them down, we show that they're valuable to the speakers of those languages. And kind of the overarching principle behind all of this is community development. So if you think for a second about your first language. Your first language, maybe it was English, maybe it was some other language, but you did not have a choice about what your first language was. So let me write here L1. That's for first language. Okay, this is the language that you spoke as a child, the first language that came out of your mouth. And it was not a choice. Oops, let me erase that. Not a choice, right? So we learned the language spoken by our social peers, by our social group. Usually it's the language of our family or social surroundings, our parents, but it's not a choice. We don't come out of the womb thinking, oh, I think I want to be a Chinese speaker or an English speaker. We don't have a choice. Everybody can learn to speak any language in the world, but the first language you speak is based on your social surroundings. And it's not a choice. So this means that some people will have access to literacy, like English speakers, and other people won't, right? So maybe there will be literacy, maybe there won't be literacy, and it wasn't your choice, right? It just dumb luck about which language you get to choose. So back to community development. Let me choose back this red pen here. So back to community development. When we're talking about language conservation, what we mean is developing the community so that they have access to all the linguistic resources that other communities have access to. So we create literacy materials, right? And we create access to other socioeconomic resources. Let me give you a little bit more over here so you can see my S. Very good. Kind of messy, but that's okay. So what we're trying to do is create this. So we can say, oh, literacy is a big issue, and it is. But if you're not teaching it in your very first language, literacy will be very impractical. It would be like if your first language was English, and I said, well, your children need to learn how to read in Japanese even though they speak English and don't know anything about Japanese. Literacy is often only possible in the first language, right? And so part of language conservation is bringing that access to linguistic resources like literacy and other socioeconomic resources like the access to the internet or job boards or things like that in their own language, because without access to it in your own language, it will have some kind of different meaning. It will be difficult for you, right? So we can be proud of our literacy levels all we want, but if we want to succeed, we need to have this kind of community development. Okay, so this, in a nutshell, is what language conservation is. Now, languageconservation.org is an institution specifically geared towards all aspects of language conservation. We have ongoing projects recording audio and video of certain languages all over the world and describing them and doing scientific research. We have literacy development and primary school education material development going on in most of our areas. So this is what we are concerned with, and this is how you can be involved.